The ships appeared at 3:47 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday. Not one ship, not a fleet in the traditional sense. A wall, a horizon of black metal that stretched from pole to pole, vessel after vessel materializing out of faster-than-light travel like ghosts stepping through a curtain, until the night sky was no longer a sky at all, it was a ceiling. A dark, breathing, mechanical ceiling that blotted out the stars and cast shadows on the oceans below. Every radar system on Earth screamed at once. Colonel Yara Osai was in the middle of her second coffee at NORAD when the screens went white. She had run drills for this. Everyone had run drills for this, quietly, privately, the kind of drills that governments don't publicize, because publicizing them would mean admitting you believed it could happen. She stood up from her chair slowly, the coffee mug still in her hand, and stared at the cascading alerts with the expression of a woman whose brain was still 2 seconds behind reality. "Talk to me," she said. "Ma'am," the young lieutenant at the sensor array couldn't keep his voice steady. "We're reading over 400,000 individual craft in low Earth orbit, distributed, every continent, every ocean. They're everywhere, ma'am, all at once." She set the coffee down. "Get me the president. Get me every head of state you can find. Get me anyone with a uniform and a pulse." It took 11 minutes to assemble an emergency global response network. It was, by any historical measure, the fastest coordinated international communication in human history. 11 minutes. Later, people would call it miraculous. In the moment, it felt like an eternity. Then the broadcast came. It didn't come through radio. It didn't come through any frequency humanity used. It came through every screen on Earth simultaneously. Every phone, every television, every laptop, every billboard, every digital display in every airport and train station and hospital waiting room. The signal bypassed every firewall, every closed network, every supposedly secure system. One moment the screens showed whatever they had been showing. The next, they showed him. The supreme executor of the Vreth Dominion stood 7 feet tall, wrapped in armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face, if it could be called a face, was broad and angular, with 4 eyes arranged in a vertical line, each one a deep, luminescent amber. He stood with the posture of someone who had never, not once in his entire life, been told no. He spoke, the words came in every language, perfectly rendered, without lag or error, in the dialect of each region receiving the broadcast. In Nairobi, it was Swahili. In Beijing, Mandarin. In rural Alabama, English with a cadence so natural it felt local. The translation technology alone was a message. "We have studied you thoroughly, and we did not find it difficult." The message itself was 7 sentences long. "People of Earth, you are now subjects of the Vreth Dominion. This is not a negotiation. This is not a request. You will stand down all military operations, surrender all governing authority to Dominion representatives, and await processing. You have 6 rotations of your star to comply. Resistance will be addressed. This concludes the announcement." The screen went dark. For approximately 4 seconds, the entire connected world was silent. Then the internet exploded. Not with panic, or rather, not only with panic. With chaos, yes. With fear, absolutely. Families were calling each other. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Churches filled within the hour. In some cities, people ran. In others, they walked outside and stared up at the shadow where the sky used to be, necks craned, faces unreadable. But somewhere between the fear and the chaos, something else emerged. Something that was perhaps uniquely, stubbornly, almost pathologically human. Someone made a meme. Then someone else did. Then 10,000 people did. A retired Marine sergeant in Oklahoma, a broad-shouldered man named Dale Briggs who had done 3 tours and lost count of how many times someone had tried to kill him, sat down in front of his camera with a can of beer and a look of profound, almost philosophical calm. 6 days, he said to his camera, cracking the can open. They gave us 6 days, 47 planets, and the best timeline they could offer Earth was 6 days. He took a long drink. I've had food poisoning that lasted longer than that. I've been in traffic jams longer than that. He looked directly into the lens. 6 days is plenty. The video reached 1 billion views before sunrise. Aboard the command vessel Eternal Conquest, hovering 112 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean, the Vreth communications team flagged the video for behavioral analysis. The xenoanalyst assigned to Earth, a scholar named Verath Sal who had spent 30 years studying humanity from long-range observation, arrays, watched it 3 times. Then she pulled up every other piece of communication she could access from the last 4 hours. The jokes, the memes, the man in Brazil who had walked outside with a guitar and was playing defiant rock music at the sky. The community in South Korea that had organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss practical resistance measures and was serving food. The city in Poland where residents had begun spray painting murals on buildings, not prayers, not farewells, but declarations. Verathsal had never, in 30 years of study, encountered a behavioral profile like this. She understood the science of fear responses. She had cataloged the psychological collapse patterns of 47 civilizations across 4 centuries of dominion conquest. There was a shape to it, always, the shape of prey cornered, the shape of a species computing its own odds and finding them insurmountable. Humanity was computing its odds. She could see the mathematics being discussed in real time on their open networks. The analysts, the journalists, the academics, they all understood the numbers. They all understood that 400,000 ships represented a force no human military on Earth could match. They understood it. And then they appeared to set it aside and start asking what they were going to do about it anyway. Verathsal stared at her screen for a long time. Then she opened a new file and began typing a preliminary report. She wrote 3 sentences and stopped, deleted them, started again. She had written thousands of behavioral reports across her career. She had precise clinical language for every known response pattern. She did not have language for this. She marked the report pending further observation and closed it. In the morning, humanity went to work. Not the governments, those were scrambling, convening, drafting protocols. Ordinary people. Engineers who hadn't slept, pulling up schematics on laptops in kitchens while their partners fed the children. Chemists, farmers, hackers, teachers who understood physics better than they'd ever been paid to. Teenagers who had spent their adolescence dismantling and rebuilding machines for fun, who had grown up on stories of impossible resistance, and believed in them with a purity that adults had mostly forgotten. 6 days. The Vreth had given Earth 6 days because 6 days was more than enough. It had always been more than enough. They had never met a species that could use 6 days the way humanity was about to. On the morning of day 2, Lieutenant General Sophia Reyes stood in a warehouse in the outskirts of Madrid and stared at what her engineers had built overnight and tried to find words adequate to the situation. What sat before her was, technically speaking, a weapon. She used the word technically because the device had been assembled from components of an industrial copper mining laser, the hydraulic arm of a construction crane, targeting software originally designed for agricultural pest control drones, a cooling system stolen from a commercial refrigeration unit, and she checked the report again to make sure she wasn't misreading the steering mechanism from a 2019 recreational boat. "Does it work?" she asked. The engineer who had built it, a small, sleep-deprived woman named Dr. Camilla Torres, who still had motor grease on her left cheek, looked at the general with the expression of someone who had not slept in 31 hours and was running entirely on determination and bad coffee. "It works," she said. "It shouldn't, but it does." Reyes looked at the device again. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It was a monument to improvisation, held together in places by industrial adhesive and what appeared to be zip ties. It was also capable of delivering a focused thermal pulse at a range of 400 meters with enough energy to burn through the atmospheric armor the Vreth ground forces had been photographed wearing during their initial survey drones. They knew it could burn through the armor because 2 hours ago they had tested it on a sample of the armor, which a team in New Zealand had somehow obtained, and which Reyes had decided firmly not to ask too many questions about. "How many can you build?" she asked. Dr. Torres looked at her team. 4 people who had met 40 hours ago on an emergency engineering forum. 2 of them had never met in person before last night. "We have parts for 9 more, Torres said, "but I've posted the schematics." "Posted them where?" "Everywhere." Reyes understood. She nodded slowly. "How long before we see copies?" "Some are already being built." Torres pulled up her phone and showed the general a live thread, engineers from 14 countries sharing modifications, improvements, solutions to problems Torres' team hadn't even encountered yet. Someone in Japan had solved the cooling inefficiency. Someone in Nigeria had found a superior mounting configuration. Someone in Canada, of all things, had figured out how to make it cheaper and faster to assemble by replacing 3 components with a single part available at any farming supply store. The weapon was evolving in real time, across the internet, in the hands of people who had never met and might never meet. Reyes thought about what the Vreth had said. Resistance will be addressed. She wondered if they had any idea what kind of resistance they were addressing. The ground forces came on day 3. They came to 6 cities, chosen for their symbolic and logistical value: London, New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, and Lagos. The Vreth landing craft descended in perfect formation, massive dark shapes cutting through the clouds like blades, and the soldiers came down ramps in disciplined columns. 3 meters tall, black atmospheric armor that had never been breached in 4 centuries of conquest. Weapons that fired coherent energy pulses capable of leveling city blocks. The streets appeared empty. The Vreth commander of the London detachment, a veteran named Kethoran who had pacified 9 worlds, noted the absence of resistance with professional satisfaction. Empty streets meant the population had fled. Fled populations were easier to process. He signaled his force to advance toward the city center. He was 40 meters down the first street when the windows opened. Not explosively, quietly. Dozens of windows on both sides of the street, upper floors of office buildings and apartment blocks, sliding open with calm precision. What came through them was not quiet. The converted mining lasers hit 3 soldiers in the first volley. The atmospheric armor held barely and not entirely. The Vreth forces returned fire immediately, efficiently, exactly as trained. They destroyed 2 of the firing positions. They advanced toward cover. And then the drones came. They came from everywhere. Thousands of them: commercial drones, agricultural drones, construction survey drones, the kind of drones that ordinary city dwellers owned for taking videos at holidays, and which had been, over the last 48 hours, reprogrammed by people who understood code the way musicians understood instruments, fluently, creatively, and with an almost reckless confidence. The drones didn't carry weapons. Most of them carried payloads. Some carried the compounds that Dr. Tor's colleague in Lyon had synthesized. Some carried blinding agents. Some were simply used as kamikaze craft, diving into the joints of Vreth armor where the thermal tolerance was lowest. None of it should have worked by the Dominion's tactical models. None of it was supposed to be capable of threatening their forces. Kethoran filed his first battlefield casualty report in 30 years of service. The losses were small: 6 soldiers wounded, 2 seriously. By Vreth standards, it barely registered. But Kethoran was an experienced commander, and he understood something the raw numbers didn't show. He had advanced 3 blocks in 40 minutes. At that rate, in a city of 8 million people who appeared to have spent the last 2 days converting their infrastructure into an obstacle course, it would take his force 6 months to reach the city center. He requested reinforcements. Aboard the command vessel, Supreme Executor Kale Vreth received the report and frowned, a rare expression for a being who had not had reason to frown in 2 decades. He approved the reinforcements. He also, for the first time in any campaign he had commanded, asked his analysts to provide a revised timeline estimate. The analyst who delivered the revision was careful about his phrasing. He chose his words slowly, precisely, with the manner of someone delivering bad news to someone with the authority to have them executed. The revised timeline was not 6 days. It was not 60. Kale Vreth stared at the number for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "That's not possible." The analyst said nothing. The number on the screen did not change. In Madrid, Dr. Torres and her team were already working on the next version. It was smaller, faster to build, more accurate. Someone in South Korea had contributed an elegant solution to the power management problem. The new design was being replicated in workshops and garages and university labs across the planet. The Vreth had better weapons. They had better ships. They had 4 centuries of unbroken conquest behind them. What they did not have, what they had never needed before, was a plan for fighting a species that got better at fighting them every single day. Her name was Verath Sol, and she had not slept in 4 days. This was unusual. Vreth physiology required rest cycles with rigid regularity. Skipping them was uncomfortable at best, cognitively damaging at worst. But Verath Sol was a xenoanalyst, the finest behavioral scientist the Dominion had produced in 2 generations, and she was in the grip of something that her species rarely experienced so acutely. She was afraid. Not of the humans, not yet, not exactly. She was afraid of what she was reading. She had reviewed the human file before the invasion. Of course she had. It had taken her 3 days, which was generous by her standards. Most pre-spaceflight civilizations could be adequately characterized in an afternoon. Humanity had more recorded history than any non-spacefaring species she had encountered, which she had noted as statistically unusual and then set aside as a minor curiosity. She was not setting it aside now. She was reading it in full from the beginning, with the kind of attention she reserved for things that frightened her. And with every century she read, the sensation in her chest that her people called Korath, the feeling of realizing you have made a serious miscalculation, grew heavier. She read about a narrow coastal pass in ancient Greece where 300 soldiers had held an entire conquering empire for 3 days, not because they thought they could win, but because they believed that what they were defending was worth dying for. She read about a city called Stalingrad in the frozen north of a country called Russia, where 2 armies had fought over individual floors of individual buildings for 5 months, in temperatures that should have made organized conflict impossible, with casualties so staggering they defied easy comprehension. She read about an island nation that had stood alone against a military superpower for a full year, bombed nightly, and had responded to each night's bombing by cleaning up the rubble in the morning and going back to work. She read about Valley Forge, about Thermopylae, about a small boat called the Dunkirk Armada that had evacuated hundreds of thousands of soldiers under fire using civilian fishing vessels. She read about a man who had been captured, tortured, and held prisoner for 5 years and had walked out of captivity and run for political office. She read about a species that had faced the Black Death, which had killed a third of an entire continent and had rebuilt. That had faced a volcanic winter and adapted. That had, on no fewer than 6 separate occasions, developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet, and had not used them, not fully, but had also not destroyed them, because they recognized the weapons as leverage, and leverage was something humans understood with an almost instinctual clarity. They were not a peaceful species. She had known that. She had cataloged their wars, their genocides, their capacity for breathtaking cruelty toward their own kind. But she had made an error, a fundamental, career-defining, potentially catastrophic error of analytical framing. She had looked at humanity's history of internal conflict and read it as weakness, a species divided against itself, fractious, tribal, unable to maintain unity, easy to conquer because already halfway conquered by their own nature. She understood now, with horrible clarity, that she had it exactly backward. Every war humanity had fought against itself was a lesson. Every atrocity was a data point. Every defeat was studied, analyzed, argued over, turned into doctrine and counter-doctrine, and then argued over again. Humanity had been running war games against the most dangerous opponents imaginable itself for 10,000 years. They had failed and failed differently, and learned again in an endless, brutal cycle that had produced, over the millennia, something extraordinary. A species that was genuinely good at surviving conflict. Not because they were strong, not because they were unified, but because conflict was their natural environment, and they had adapted to it the way deep-sea creatures adapted to pressure, by becoming something that could not only survive it, but function in it. She found a record from a historical military strategist named Sun Tzu, written approximately 25 centuries before present day. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. It had been written as tactical advice. Reading it now, she understood it differently. It was not advice to humans, it was a description of them. She found records of a global conflict the humans called the Second World War. In the span of 6 years, they had gone from propeller-driven aircraft to jet engines to nuclear weapons. 6 years. The Dominion's weapons development cycle, optimized over centuries of conquest and refinement, moved faster than most species, but not that fast. Nothing moved that fast. Under pressure, humanity moved that fast. She thought about what was happening on the surface right now. Day 4 of what was supposed to have been a 6-day capitulation. The ground forces were bogged down in every city. The resistance was not diminishing. It was growing. And it was growing in a specific way that she now recognized with sick certainty. It was growing the way humanity had always grown under pressure. Adapting, innovating, sharing information laterally, across all its divisions and factions and rivalries, because whatever else humanity argued about among themselves, they had apparently decided that this was not an internal matter. She had read about the one time humanity had come closest to genuine unity. It had not been a philosophical movement. It had not been a shared religion or ideology. It had been an external threat. Historically, every time something external had threatened humanity, the internal squabbling had stopped, not permanently, not cleanly, but functionally. They unified the way water unified when you squeezed it, not because they chose to, but because the pressure left no other direction to go. She had given them an external threat of unprecedented scale. She had squeezed them. She closed the historical archive and sat for a long time in the silence of her research bay, the hum of the ship around her, the blue-green sphere of Earth visible through the small observation port to her left. From up here it looked quiet, peaceful even. The shadow of the fleet fell across its surface like a hand reaching down. She thought about what happened when you reached your hand toward something that had been reaching its hands toward things for 10,000 years, and developing better and better ways to stop you. She opened a new communication channel, direct, encrypted, Supreme Executor only. "I need to speak with Kale Vreth," she typed. "Priority classification, not for staff review." The response came back in 40 seconds. "The Executor is overseeing ground operations. Submit your report through standard channels." She stared at the response. Then she typed four words that no analyst in Dominion history had ever transmitted on a priority channel to a Supreme Executor during an active campaign. "We should leave now." The channel was quiet for 3 minutes. "Then report to the command bridge, immediately." She stood up. She straightened her robes. She picked up her datapad with the historical summaries, the behavioral analyses, the conflict records, the technological acceleration curves, the pattern recognition data that painted a picture so clear and so alarming she was surprised she was the only one who had assembled it. She walked to the command bridge. She was going to make her case with every piece of evidence she had. She already knew it wasn't going to be enough. The 6th day arrived, and Earth did not surrender. This was, in the 4th century history of the Vreth Dominion, a thing that had never happened. Not once. Not on any of the 47 worlds they had absorbed into their empire. The deadline had always been a formality, a kindness, almost, a civilized interval between inevitability and acceptance. No species had ever forced them to move past it. Earth moved past it with what could only be described as deliberate, organized contempt. Kale Vreth had ordered the orbital bombardment of 6 secondary targets, sites carefully selected to demonstrate consequence without destroying critical infrastructure that would be needed post-conquest. Military staging areas, communications hubs, secondary power grids, chosen to cause pain and fear without permanent damage. The bombardment commenced at precisely midnight GMT. The beams struck exactly where targeted. 6 perfect hits. 6 precise demonstrations of overwhelming orbital firepower that should have, by every model and precedent, shattered what remained of human resistance and broken the psychological spine of the opposition. They struck empty sites. All 6 pre-evacuated, not hastily, methodically. The communications hubs had been stripped of essential components before the strike and the components relocated. The military staging areas had been deliberately left with enough surface-level activity to read as occupied on Vreth sensors, while everything of actual value was moved underground or dispersed into the civilian infrastructure, hidden in warehouses and basements and tunnels that the Vreth mapping data was 4 years out of date on. Because humanity had been quietly expanding and modifying its urban tunnel networks for a decade, in a low-level civil defense program that most humans themselves had not known existed. Someone on Earth had known the bombardment targets would be those targets. Kale Vreth did not yet understand how, and that uncertainty was a new and unwelcome sensation. What happened next happened in 12 seconds. Every prepositioned defensive network on Earth activated simultaneously. Not sequentially, simultaneously. Thousands of converted weapons, drone swarms that had been holding in staging positions, naval vessels that had spent the past 6 days quietly repositioning, missile systems that had been removed from military bases and distributed into civilian shipping containers across 600 locations worldwide. The activation signal went out through a communication method the Vreth had not been monitoring, because it was built on a hardware frequency that humanity had technically deprecated 20 years ago, and which a 17-year-old in Finland had suggested via forum post on day 2 as a potential blind spot in Vreth sensor arrays, a post that had been read by the right people within the hour. The simultaneous activation did not destroy any Vreth ships. It was not designed to. Humanity's military planners were not delusional. They understood that their weapons, individually or in combination, could not match the Dominion fleet in direct confrontation. What the activation did was demonstrate coordination. An unhived, non-telepathic, linguistically divided species of 8 billion individuals, containing more than 100 distinct nations with centuries of mutual suspicion and rivalry, had just executed a simultaneous global military action with a precision that rivaled anything the Dominion's own forces were capable of. In the command center of the Eternal Conquest, the tactical officers went silent. Kale Vreth stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the activation map, 8,000 simultaneous events across the entire surface of a planet, and experienced something he had no ready category for. It was not fear. He told himself it was not fear. He told himself this several times. Below, the real war was entering its second phase. The Vreth ground forces were learning things about urban warfare that their doctrine had never anticipated, because their doctrine had been written against species that built cities as centers of population, places to protect and therefore places to surrender. Humanity had spent 6 days quietly converting its cities into something different. Every Vreth advance became a lesson in depth. City blocks that appeared clear would have 2 defenders fall back, then 4 appear from a different direction. Supply lines were struck not at their main arteries. The Vreth protected those with overwhelming force, but at their capillaries, the small logistics chains that fed the forward units, hit with such frequency and such apparent foreknowledge of Vreth routing decisions that the logistics commanders began to question whether their communications were compromised. They were, partially, a distributed network of civilian hackers, people who had never worked for any government, who operated under pseudonyms and had never met each other, who had spent years penetrating encrypted networks for personal amusement, had found 3 vulnerabilities in the Vreth tactical communication encryption within 96 hours. They had not announced this. They had simply begun using the access quietly, feeding relevant intelligence upward through channels that the military had established for exactly this kind of contribution. The Vreth unit commanders were trained for resistance. They were trained for fierce resistance, even. Every species had soldiers willing to die for their world, and the Vreth were prepared for that. What they were not prepared for was an enemy that fought, retreated, adapted, appeared somewhere new with a different tactic, retreated again, adapted again, and never stopped coming. An enemy that appeared to have no breaking point, not because they couldn't break. They could see the humans were suffering, the casualties were real, but because the breaking point, wherever it existed, was somewhere beyond the range of anything the Vreth had yet done. On day 8, 2 days past the deadline that was supposed to end this, Kale Vreth received a report that the ground force in Lagos had been forced to withdraw from 3 blocks they had already pacified, because a civilian resistance cell had reoccupied them in the night and fortified them using construction materials from a demolished building, and the tactical cost of retaking them outweighed the strategic value. He read the report, he read it twice. Then he did something he had never done in his military career. He walked to the observation deck of the Eternal Conquest alone without his staff, and he looked at the planet below. He looked at it for a long time. Blue and green and white, scarred here and there by his bombardment, wreathed in cloud, giving nothing away. He thought about the broadcast, 6 rotations of your star. He had said it the way you say something you are completely certain of, the way you say the sun will rise. He thought about the word forever. Not surrender, not victory, just forever. This world, this stubborn, impossible, inexhaustible world could make this last forever. And the Dominion, he knew his own empire well enough to know, could not afford forever. Could not afford the cost, the time, the resources, the psychological weight of a campaign that never resolved. Other territories needed attention. The empire required momentum. The machinery of conquest ran on the fuel of success, and success required completion, and this was not completing. He called his senior command staff. He did not tell them what he was thinking. He asked them a question instead. If we are still here in 30 days, he said, what does that mean for the Dominion? The silence that answered him was the most honest thing anyone on the bridge had said in a week. 17 civilizations were watching. This was not unusual. The Vreth invasions always drew observers. It was considered a display of dominance as much as a military campaign, and the message was intended for the galaxy as much as for the target species. Watch what happens to those who stand outside the Dominion. Watch what inevitability looks like from a distance. The 17 observers watched. They watched for 6 days, expecting to see what they had always seen, a rapid collapse, a formal surrender, the beginning of absorption. They had their own analysts, their own behavioral models, their own historical records of Vreth campaigns. The pattern was well established, comfortable even in the way that terrible certainties become comfortable simply because they are consistent. By day 8, none of them were comfortable. The Serenthi Collective, the oldest spacefaring civilization currently active, a species that had watched the Vreth rise from a regional power to a galactic empire over 3 centuries, convened an emergency High Council session in their capital on day 9. The chamber was a semicircular hall of pale blue stone, built to accommodate 200 counselors, and it was full. Elder diplomat Thessara Ven stood at the center floor. She had served the collective for 60 years. She had seen things. She was not, by nature or by experience, an alarmist. She was alarmed. "I want to share something with this council," she said, in the measured cadence of formal address that she had used for 6 decades without falter. "It will take some time. I ask for your patience because I believe what I am about to show you changes the context of everything we are observing." She presented the archive. It was not her archive. She had assembled it in the past 4 days from human sources, their own historical records broadcast freely on their information networks, available to anyone with a receiver and the right translation protocols. She had not needed to spy. She had simply needed to look, and apparently no one had looked carefully enough before. She showed them Thermopylae. She showed them Stalingrad. She walked the council through the entirety of what humans called the Second World War, a 6-year catastrophe that had consumed a significant portion of an entire planet and produced, as a byproduct, jet propulsion, nuclear fission, the foundational concepts of modern computing, and a military-industrial capacity that made every nation involved substantially more capable of violence at the end than at the beginning. She showed them the Cold War, a decades-long standoff between 2 superpowers, each holding weapons capable of ending the human species, who had not used those weapons not because they couldn't, but because they understood deterrence with an almost preternatural clarity, and who had instead competed through proxies and technology and propaganda and sport until the tension resolved not in annihilation, but in geopolitical restructuring. She showed them the plagues, the famines, the ice ages humans had survived before they had writing, the meteor impact event their own scientists had identified in the geological record that had reduced the global population to perhaps 10,000 individuals, 10,000, a number smaller than a small city, from which humanity had recovered, diversified, and eventually produced Shakespeare and the Internet and 11,000 nuclear warheads. The council watched in mounting silence. "I want to be precise about what I am not saying," Thessara Ven said. "I am not saying the humans will defeat the Vreth fleet in direct confrontation. They cannot. The mathematics do not support that conclusion." "Then what are you saying?" asked Councillor Drath Heath from the East delegation. She turned to face him directly. "I am saying that the Vreth do not need to be defeated in direct confrontation for this campaign to destroy them." She paused, letting that sit. "The Vreth Empire runs on certainty, on the perception of inevitability. Every species they have conquered, every world they have absorbed, the Empire's power comes not just from military capacity, but from the belief of subject peoples that resistance is futile." She looked around the chamber. "What happens to that belief if this campaign does not end? What happens to every tributary species, every semi-autonomous vassal world, every civilization currently paying Dominion tariffs and following Dominion law because they believe there is no alternative? What happens to all of them if they watch the Vreth grind against one pre-spaceflight civilization for months and fail to close the campaign?" The chamber was quiet. "The humans do not need to win," she said. "They need to not lose. And from everything I have studied in the past 4 days, I believe the distinction between those two things is something the human species grasps at a biological level." She brought up one final piece of evidence. A behavioral study she had commissioned from her own analysts, correlating human resistance intensity with time elapsed. The graph moved the wrong way. For every species in the Dominion's historical record, resistance decayed over time, diminished as casualties mounted, as infrastructure failed, as psychological exhaustion set in. The curve always sloped downward. The human resistance curve sloped upward. It sloped upward because with every passing day, more of the people who had been hesitating out of shock and disbelief were making a decision. The decision had a particular quality to it that Thessara Ven's analysts had struggled to translate accurately. The closest approximation in Serenthi was a phrase that roughly meant enough of this. A threshold, reached individually and then collectively, after which hesitation ended and commitment began. And on the commitment side of that threshold, the data suggested, humans became something qualitatively different. "My final point," the elder diplomat said, "is this. We have all in this chamber been paying Dominion tribute for a very long time. We have all justified that payment to ourselves and to our people on the grounds that there is no realistic alternative." She closed her datapad. "I would ask this council to consider whether the events at Sol's system might be changing what constitutes a realistic alternative." The chamber erupted. It was not agreement. It was not a resolution. It was argument, fierce, frightened, excited, exhausted argument that went on for 7 hours and produced no formal conclusion. But the argument had started, and Thessaraven, who had spent 60 years watching civilizations hold their tongues in the presence of power, understood that argument was how change began. That argument was, in some ways, the most important first step. The humans would have recognized it instantly. They'd been arguing their way forward for 10,000 years. He was born on the Vreth homeworld in the 43rd year of the current empire, which meant he had never known a Vreth dominion that was not dominant. He had grown up in the certainty of it the way others grew up in gravity. It was simply the shape of reality, the unexamined background against which all other things occurred. He had joined the military at 17. He had served under 2 supreme executors before ascending to the role himself at the relatively young age of 53. He had overseen 9 campaigns, each successful, each complete. He was, by every measure the Dominion had ever devised, tactical record, territory acquired, population processed, administrative efficiency, the finest military commander alive. He sat in his private chamber aboard the Eternal Conquest and looked at the numbers and felt something he had no practice recognizing. The numbers were not catastrophic. He kept returning to that fact because it was the only thing that continued to feel stable. Total ground force casualties, 1,114. Wounded, 3,221. Ship losses, 0. Dominion territory compromised, 0. By any reasonable metric of large-scale military operations, these were acceptable losses for a campaign in its second week against a species with genuine will to resist. But the numbers were moving in the wrong direction, and they were moving faster than they should have. And the models, his models, the Dominion's finest predictive tools, refined across 4 centuries of unbroken conquest, could not generate a confident timeline for campaign completion. Every time his analysts ran the projection, the error bars grew wider. He called Verath Sol to his private chamber, not the bridge, not in front of his staff. She came in, and he noticed for the first time how hollow she looked, how sleepless. He was not a species given to physical demonstrations of concern, but he gestured to a chair, and she sat in it with the relief of someone who has been standing for too long. "Tell me," he said, "what you told me 10 days ago was wrong about." She looked at him. "I told you we should leave. You told me the campaign would be completed within a week." "I am not asking you to say you were right and I was wrong," he said, with a precision that she recognized as an executive choosing his words carefully. "I am asking you to help me understand what I don't understand. What is it about this species that our models failed to account for?" She thought about the historical archives she'd spent 2 weeks reading. She thought about the graph with the resistance curve that went up instead of down. She thought about a species that had spent 10,000 years fighting itself and emerging, each time more capable. "Every species we have encountered," she said slowly, "has a breaking point, a threshold of cost beyond which they determine resistance is not worth the price. It is a rational calculation. We are trained to understand it, to model it, to reach it efficiently." She paused. "Humans have breaking points individually, but collectively, at the species level, they appear to have replaced the breaking point with something else." "What?" "An identity." She leaned forward slightly. "They have built their entire culture around the concept of surviving things that should have broken them. It is in their stories, their religion, their history, their art. They don't just survive catastrophe, they make meaning out of it. They turn it into something they are proud of. Every impossible survival becomes a piece of evidence for a narrative they have about themselves." She met his eyes. "And that narrative, executor, is that they cannot be broken. That when everything seems lost is precisely when they become most dangerous. They believe this about themselves so deeply and so consistently that it has become, functionally, true." He was quiet for a moment. "And our campaign," he said carefully, "is providing them with more evidence for that narrative. Every day we are here, every Vreth soldier they stop, every adaptation they make, every morning they wake up still fighting, we are adding to the story." She sat back. "We came here to show the galaxy what inevitability looks like. Instead, we are showing them what a species looks like when it refuses to accept inevitability, and those are opposite messages." He stood and walked to the observation port. Earth hung below. He stared at it for a long time. He thought about the Empire. He thought about tributary worlds that were watching this campaign. He thought about what it meant for the Dominion's position in the galaxy if this campaign ran for another month. 3 months, 6. He thought about the resources, not just military, but political. The Dominion's authority rested on the perception of its authority. Perception was fragile. It required maintenance. And the best maintenance was success that was clean and complete and unambiguous. This was not going to be clean and complete and unambiguous. He thought about what he would be remembered as. In 4 centuries of Dominion history, he would be the supreme executor who failed to close a campaign against a pre-spaceflight species. The first, the only, it would define him, it would follow his name into history like a scar. He thought about this for a long time. Then he thought about the alternative, continuing a campaign that his own analysts could no longer model to completion, on a world that appeared to grow stronger against him with every passing day, while the galaxy watched and drew its own conclusions. He made his decision. Not because he was afraid. He told himself this firmly, not because the losses were unbearable or the campaign was unwinnable in any absolute sense. He made it because he was, above all things, a strategist, and a strategist knew when a battle was costing more than it could return. He returned to his desk and opened a communication channel. "I want a ceasefire offer prepared," he said. "Frame it as a diplomatic gesture, a willingness to negotiate the terms of Earth's integration on humanitarian grounds." He paused. "And I want it delivered tonight." His communications officer blinked. "Once, a ceasefire executor." "You have your orders." "Yes, executor." The officer left. Kale Vreth sat alone in his chamber for a moment. He thought about a species that laughed when they should have panicked, and built weapons from mining equipment and farming supplies, and hacked alien encryption for sport, and put lawyers on their emergency response council. He thought, very briefly, about what it would have been like to conquer a different planet. Then he put the thought away and began composing his strategic withdrawal report for the Dominion High Command. He would need very precise language. He was already thinking about the language. He was, after all, a professional. The station was called Neutral Point Orem, a name that sounded grander than the reality, which was a mid-size commercial way station that had been hastily cleared of its usual cargo traffic and declared neutral ground by the Serenthi Collective, the Marin Assembly, and the Collective of Drath, 3 civilizations who had collectively decided that being the mediators of this negotiation was less dangerous than not being involved and having the outcome determined without them. It was not an elegant facility. The negotiating chamber had, until 48 hours ago, been a cargo scheduling office. Folding chairs of mismatched design had been arranged around a long table of synthetic polymer in a color that the station manager had assured everyone was meant to be calming. The Vreth delegation arrived first. 6 individuals, Kale Vreth at their center, the others arranged in the precise geometric formation that Dominion protocol required for formal proceedings. They wore full ceremonial dress, the deep black and gold that signified executive authority, the kind of presentation designed to communicate that those wearing it were unaccustomed to being on equal footing with anyone. They sat with perfect stillness and arranged their data pads with the precision of people who were determined that this should look like their idea. The human delegation was late. Not by accident. Yara Os, who had been coordinating Earth's ground defense for 2 weeks and had slept perhaps 20 total hours in that period, had specifically advised the delegation to arrive 7 minutes late. "Not enough to be insulting," she had said in the briefing. "Enough to establish that we are not anxious." The 3 humans who walked in at the 7-minute mark were not generals. They were not heads of state. Earth's World Emergency Council had deliberated for 4 hours on who to send, and had ultimately reached a consensus that surprised almost everyone who heard it. They sent lawyers. Specifically, they sent Advocate General Dr. Priya Nair of the International Court, Senior Treaty Specialist Marcus Webb from the UN Legal Division, and International Law Professor Dr. Amara Diallo, who had spent 30 years specializing in the legal frameworks of post-conflict settlements, and who had, upon being asked to join this delegation, reportedly responded with, "Obviously, give me an hour to pack." They came in without ceremony. Dr. Nair at the front, carrying a leather portfolio, actual leather, actual portfolio, actual paper documents inside, a choice so anachronistic in the context of galactic diplomacy that 3 of the mediating representatives later admitted they had assumed it was some kind of psychological tactic. It was, in fact, simply what she used. She was 61 years old, and she had conducted international negotiations in this manner for 30 years, and saw no particular reason to change. They sat. Kale Vreth looked at the 3 humans with an expression that took him considerable discipline to keep neutral. He had been prepared for military commanders, for heads of state, for diplomats with the brittle deference of people who knew they had come from the weaker position and were trying not to show it. The woman who sat across from him was reading a document. She finished the paragraph, turned the page, and looked up. "Supreme Executor," she said. Her translator rendered it in perfect Vreth cadence. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "The Dominion is always willing to discuss the terms of integration," Kale Vreth said, which was the framing his team had prepared, positioning this as a conversation about how Earth would join the Dominion, not whether the campaign had failed. Dr. Nair looked at him with an expression of polite attentiveness. "That's interesting," she said, "because I have prepared documents outlining the terms of withdrawal, reparation, and a non-interference covenant. I was under the impression that was what we were here to discuss." She opened the portfolio and slid a document across the table. "If there's been a miscommunication about the purpose of today's meeting, we can certainly take a short recess to align." The Vreth delegation was quiet for 2 seconds. In Vreth negotiating terms, 2 seconds of delegation silence was the equivalent of a shout. The document she had slid across was 63 pages long. Marcus Webb had spent 72 hours writing it. It demanded reparations calculated to the specific cost of infrastructure damage, with interest. It demanded a formal withdrawal timeline with verification clauses. It demanded a non-interference guarantee backed by third-party Serenthi enforcement, a clause that implicitly required the Serenthi to take a position against Vreth action, something no one had ever extracted from them before. It included, on page 47, a clause requiring the Dominion to formally acknowledge the ceasefire in public broadcast terms that left no interpretive ambiguity about what had occurred. No conquered world had ever produced a document like this, because no conquered world had ever been in a position to produce a document like this. Kale Vreth read the first page. He turned to page 47. He read it. He looked up. "You are a conquered people," he said. The translator gave it the full weight the words carried in Vreth. Dr. Nair did not flinch. She did not look away. She sat with the absolute composure of a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms with people who were certain their authority was greater than hers. "With respect, Executor," she said, "you came here to conquer us, and here we both are at a table." She let that sit for exactly 1 breath. "You do the math." 11 seconds of silence. Every person in the room counted them afterward and arrived at the same number. Then Kale Vreth said, "We will require time to review the document." "Of course," Dr. Nair said. She smiled, precisely enough to be genuine, not enough to be gloating. She was, after all, a professional. "We've allowed 4 hours. We also took the liberty of arranging lunch." She gestured to the side table where the station manager had arranged refreshments, human food, prepared for the delegation because no one had thought to bring anything else, and Dr. Diallo had simply handled it. The mediation representatives later testified, unanimously, that the expression on the Supreme Executor's face in that moment was one they had never seen on a Vreth official before. They struggled to name it accurately. The closest any of them came was a Serenthi word that approximately translated as, the face of someone who has just understood something they wish they had understood earlier. Negotiations ran for 6 more hours. Every single clause in Dr. Nair's document was signed. The fleet left on a Wednesday. The same formation in which it had arrived, that immense, horizon-swallowing wall of black metal, the architecture of overwhelming power, the visual language of inevitability, now moved in the opposite direction. Out of Earth orbit, past the moon, through the inner system and into the deep black, accelerating toward the FTL threshold. It took 4 hours to complete the withdrawal. 4 hours because there were so many ships that even at speed the visual effect, watching that ceiling of metal move away, watching the sky slowly return, watching stars appear in the gaps between departing vessels like light through opening fingers, could not be rushed. People stood outside all over the world and watched it happen. They watched in silence mostly, exhausted silence. The kind that comes after something you cannot fully process yet, that you know you will spend years understanding. A child in Osaka asked her mother what it meant. Her mother, who had not slept in 3 days, who had spent those days running an emergency community shelter in a school gymnasium, looked up at the retreating fleet and said simply, "It means we won." The child thought about this. Did we know we were going to? Her mother thought about Dale Briggs and his beer and his 6 days. She thought about Dr. Torres and her impossible laser in a Madrid warehouse. She thought about Priya Nair sliding 63 pages across a table with the calm of someone doing something perfectly ordinary. "No," she said, "we didn't know, we just didn't stop." Her daughter nodded as though this made complete sense. Perhaps, at 7 years old, it did. The footage of the withdrawal was transmitted across known space by the 17 observing civilizations before the last Vreth vessel had cleared the outer system. Raw feed, unedited, broadcast on every frequency that the galactic community used for significant events. The kind of broadcast that interrupted regular programming. The kind that made people stop what they were doing and gather around screens. The galactic community watched the Vreth fleet leave. It watched in silence, as the child in Osaka had watched in silence, and then it began, slowly, to recalculate. Not all at once, not with any coordinated decision. Recalculation is not a moment, it is a process. It happens in the gap between what you knew and what you now cannot unknow, and it runs at different speeds in different minds and different chambers and different civilizations. But it began, and once something begins in that particular way, it does not stop. The Marin Assembly quietly recalled their tribute payment processing officers from Dominion administrative centers. Just for review, they said. Just a standard audit. The Dominion did not press the matter, because the Dominion was, for the first time in 4 centuries, not in a position to press matters without calculating what pressing might cost. The collective of Drath issued a statement expressing their interest in establishing formal relations with Earth. This was technically premature. Earth was not a spacefaring civilization, and had no galactic standing under existing frameworks written entirely by civilizations that were not Earth and had not anticipated this situation. 3 different legal scholars immediately began writing papers on the question of whether those frameworks needed revision. The question had never been considered before. The consideration had now begun. 3 Dominion vassal worlds filed internal legal challenges to the terms of their absorption agreements. The challenges had no precedent. They also now had a precedent, the image of a leather portfolio and 63 pages, and a table where a pre-spaceflight species had sat with the conquered world's supreme executor and spoken in the plain language of equals. What precedent does to an empire built on the absence of precedent is not immediately dramatic. It is architectural, like water finding the small cracks in stone, slow, patient, invisible until the day it isn't. On Earth, the aftermath was messy, because aftermath on Earth was always messy. There were arguments about what to do next, about how to develop a defensive fleet, about who would control it, about resource allocation, about the terms of the reparations and how to spend them, about what relationship with the galactic community should look like, about who had the authority to make any of these decisions and how that authority should be structured. There were nations that wanted a different framework and nations that wanted no framework and individuals who were certain they personally had the right answer, and were completely certain the other individuals who were also certain had it wrong. It was, in other words, exactly what humanity had always done with a problem. Argued about it loudly, arrived at compromises that satisfied no one completely and everyone adequately, and moved forward into the next argument. Verathsal watched it from the departing Eternal Conquest through her observation port until the blue-green sphere was too small to see. She had her final report open on her datapad. She had been composing it for 3 days. It was the most important document she had ever written, and she knew it, and knowing it made every word feel inadequate. She wrote it anyway. She wrote about the historical pattern, the aggression, the creativity, the adaptation, the impossible resistance curves. She wrote about 10,000 years of internal conflict that had produced a species for whom catastrophe was a familiar environment. She wrote about unity as a pressure response rather than a cultural default. She wrote about the specific, dangerous quality of a species that experienced impossible situations as evidence of its own resilience rather than evidence of its own limitation. She wrote about the lawyers. She came to the concluding paragraph and sat with it for a long time. She wanted precision. She wanted whoever read this, whoever had the authority and the foresight to read it and take it seriously, to understand exactly what she was saying without exaggeration, without alarm she couldn't support, without the kind of vague warnings that got filed and forgotten. She wrote, "They are not the strongest species we have encountered. They are not the most advanced. They do not possess the greatest weapons or the longest history or the deepest resources. What they possess is more dangerous than any of these things. They possess the absolute, unshakable, biologically persistent conviction, held individually, confirmed collectively in the face of all contradicting evidence that they are going to win, that they have always won. That winning is what they do. We have no counter-doctrine for this. We did not develop one in time. I am not certain one exists. I am certain that the next civilization to require one should begin working on it before they need it, because by the time you need it, it will be too late. She paused, read it back. Added one more sentence. Do not go to Earth unless you are prepared for what Earth will do to the story you tell about yourself. She submitted the report. The command filed it under classified, then elevated it to restricted. Then, 3 weeks later, quietly, without announcement, in the middle of an administrative session that had 17 other items on the agenda, deleted it from the official record. Some things are too useful to make widely available. Some things are too frightening. On Earth, the sun rose on a Thursday, the first Thursday after the fleet had gone, and it rose over a planet that was exactly the same as it had been before and completely different. The same oceans. The same cities, some of them scarred and burned and being cleared and rebuilt with the same methodical energy that humans had always brought to the business of repairing what they'd broken or had broken for them. The same 7-year-old girl in Osaka, asking questions that her mother didn't have complete answers for. But different too, wider somehow. A planet that had looked up at the edge of its own sky and found the universe on the other side and had stared it down. A planet that had always been here, turning on its own lights in the dark, fighting its own wars in the dark, building its own monuments in the dark, telling its own stories in the dark, that had finally, at cost, been seen. The galaxy had come to teach humanity what it was. It had learned instead. And somewhere in the deep black between stars, in the hold of a withdrawing fleet, a xenoanalyst sat with her deleted report and her overflowing historical archive and the face of Kael'vreth in that 11-second silence, and thought about the girl in Osaka and her question and her mother's answer. We didn't know, we just didn't stop. She thought this was perhaps the most important sentence spoken by any species in the history of known space. She thought it would be a very long time before the galaxy forgot what it meant. And